There's a workshop outside Providence, Rhode Island, that nobody has opened since 1981. The county finally condemned the house last spring, termites mostly, a roof that gave up trying. But when the demolition crew went in to clear it out, they found the basement locked from the inside, bolted, not just closed, and behind that door, a workbench covered in dust, so thick it looked like snow, and sitting in the middle of it, a radio. Except it isn't a radio, not really. It's 40 channels of AM band hardwired into a reel-to-reel recorder, wrapped in a tangle of copper wire and soldered joints that a 1970s electronics catalog would not recognize. There is a nameplate screwed into the housing, hand engraved. It says, "Threshold." And when the crew, because of course they did, because you would want to, plugged it in and switched it on, it said a name that, as far as anyone can tell, no living person in that basement had ever spoken out loud. I'm your host, and this is the Phantom Navigator. Today we're talking about the tools, the gadgets, the gizmos, the beeping boxes you've seen in every ghost hunting show since 2004. Where they actually came from, whether any of them do what they claim, and a man who built one of the strangest ones in a basement alone, trying to call his dead son back through static. Let's get into it. Elias Marsh was not a ghost hunter. I want to be clear about that up front, because it matters. He was an acoustic engineer, a real one. The kind who spent the 60s designing concert hall, dampening panels, and consulting for a hearing aid manufacturer out of Boston. He understood frequency the way a chef understands heat. He knew, better than almost anyone alive, in 1968 exactly how sound moves, bends, and dies. In 1972, his son Peter drowned at a lake in New Hampshire. He was 11. Elias did what a lot of grieving parents did in that era. Went to a medium, sat through a seance, felt nothing but the particular specific humiliation of paying a stranger to fake a miracle for you. But unlike most people, Elias didn't walk away disillusioned. He walked away with a hypothesis. If the dead could not be summoned, he reasoned, maybe they could tune into, not conjured, received, like a radio signal already broadcasting just outside the range human ears were built to catch. He spent the next 9 years building a machine to catch it. This is where his story tangles up with a much bigger one, because Elias wasn't working in a vacuum. He was, whether he knew it or not, standing at the exact midpoint of a 100-year-old obsession. The idea that grief could be engineered into evidence. Let's back up. Long before EMF meters and thermal cameras, the very first piece of paranormal equipment was a small wooden board on wheels, a planchette, and it showed up in the 1850s, right in the middle of spiritualism boom. Spiritualism was less a religion and more national mood. Mediums held parlor seances up and down the East Coast, and the tools followed the demand. Talking boards, spirit cabinets, trumpet horns that supposedly amplified a ghost's whisper into something the living could hear. The Ouija board, patented in 1890, was originally marketed as a parlor game, a novelty that happened to tap into something people were already desperate to believe in. Here's the through line I want you to hold on to. Every single one of these devices did the same basic job. They didn't detect anything. They gave the sitter's own mind peace of mind, a place to put its hope. The duometer effect, where your hand moves involuntarily based on expectation with zero conscious intent, explains most of what planchette or Ouija board ever said. Your body already knows what you want to hear. The board just gives it permission to say it. Then in the 20th century, handed grief a new toy, electronics. Electronic voice phenomena, EVP, enters the picture in the 1950s and 60s when a few researchers, Attila von Zele, later Konstantin Raudive, started recording blank tape in empty rooms and claiming they caught voices on playback that nobody in the room had spoken. Raudive published a book with over 70,000 supposed spirit recordings. Skeptics call it a textbook case of audio pareidolia, the brain's compulsion to find language in noise, the same reflex that makes you hear "get out" in a running dishwasher. By the 2000s, the tools got a lot more aggressive about it. The Ovilus, a handheld device that scans environmental readings and converts them into words from a pre-loaded dictionary, claims to let spirits speak through algorithmic word selections. The spirit box, sometimes called Frank's box, after the inventor, Frank Sumption, rapidly scans AM/FM radio frequencies, stitching together fragments of stations into what sounds, if you want to call it, like disjoint sentences. EMF meters measure electromagnetic field fluctuations, genuinely useful in their original context, which is checking your house wiring for hazards. The paranormal community adopted them in the 90s on the theory that spirits disrupt electromagnetic fields. What they much more reliably detect: old knobs and tubes wiring, a cell phone in your pocket, or a space heater 2 rooms away. REM pods create their own small electromagnetic field and alert when something disrupts it. Same core assumption, same vulnerability to mundane interference. Thermal cameras hunt for cold spots, which real buildings produce constantly for reasons ranging from drafts to structural gaps in your own body, heat, and leaving a shadow on a cold wall. None of these tools were designed, tested, or peer reviewed to detect a spirit. They were repurposed. Every one of them was borrowed from a legitimate industrial or scientific use and handed a new job by people who needed it to have one. Look, I'm not saying that to be a killjoy. I'm saying it because I think it's the saddest fact that in this entire episode, these weren't con artists building props. Most of them were people like Elias, engineers, believers, parents, people who understood machines well enough to know exactly how to make one say what they needed it to. Let's talk about why this stuff works on us even when we know better, because I know it works on me. Pareidolia is your brain's tendency to impose a recognizable pattern, a face, a word, a voice, into random or ambiguous stimuli. It's not a flaw, it's a feature that kept your ancestors alive. Better to see a face in the bushes that isn't there than miss one that is. Apply the same wiring to a spirit box cycling through a radio static at 10 frequencies a second, and your brain will assemble sentences out of scraps, guaranteed, every single time. Infrasound. Sound below 20 hertz, under the threshold of conscious hearing, has been linked in several studies to feeling unease, cold chills, even a sense of being watched. Some old buildings, old HVAC systems, and even certain wind conditions through architecture can't produce infrasound. Nobody in the room consciously perceives, while everybody in the room feels the dread it causes. And then there's expectation itself. Walk into a location you've been told is haunted, and your threat detection system already primed. Every creak is a warning. Every cold draft is a hand on your neck. This isn't gullibility. It's basic neuroscience. The same mechanism that makes a hospital hallway feel different at 3 a.m. than it does at 3 p.m. Even though it's the exact same hallway. None of this disproves anything beyond the veil. What it proves is that human perception is an incredibly unreliable narrator, and any device built to interface with the paranormal is also unavoidably a device built to interface with us. Back to the basement. By the accounts of people who's worked with him, a former colleague from the acoustics firm contacted years later, Elias didn't tell anyone what he was building. He took early retirement in 1975, cited health reasons, and by all appearances spent the next 6 years alone in that house, refining a machine that had, at that point, no real precedent. Frank Sumption wouldn't build his own spirit box for another 2 decades. Elias got there first, from a completely different direction, not looking for a ghost, looking for his. The neighbors remembered the sound, a low continuous hiss, day and night, bleeding through the basement windows for years. One recalled Elias buying nothing but batteries and copper wire from the hardware store, month after month, paying an exact change, never explaining, never really speaking much at all. He eventually died in that basement in 1981. Heart failure, the coroner said, though the reports noted he was found seated upright at the workbench, headphones on, the reel-to-reel still spinning, recording nothing but tape hiss, over and over, for who knows how many hours before anyone found him. The house sat empty for decades after. Family disputes over estate. Nobody wanted to deal with the basement. Which brings us to last spring, and a demolition crew, and a machine that had sat untouched and unplugged for over 40 years, and still, when connected to a battery pack, powered on like it had been waiting. I've listened to the recordings the crew made. I'm not going to tell you what to believe about it. I'll tell you what's on the tape, and you can make your own call, which frankly is the only honest thing anyone can offer you in this entire subject. Under the static, there's a fragment that sounds like a name, 3 syllables. The crew didn't recognize it, but when a genealogist later pulled the Marsh family records, there was a name buried in there that fits almost exactly. A name belonging to Elias' wife, who had died 2 years before he ever built the machine, and who, by every account, had never once mentioned to a living soul after her funeral. Genealogist, okay. Maybe the threshold really did catch something no signal analysis has ever explained. Or maybe a grieving engineer built a machine so sensitive to noise, so desperate to produce meaning, that 4 decades later, it's still doing exactly what he designed it to do, turning static into whatever a listener needs to hear. I'm not sure that's a less haunting explanation. I think it might be worse. So, Paranormal Equipment 101. The tools were never really measured for ghosts. They were measuring us. Our need, our grief, our absolutely relentless refusal to accept that some silences just don't answer back. Elias Marsh spent 9 years building a machine to break that silence. Whether it worked is, as always on this show, entirely up to you. If you got a piece of paranormal gear with a story attached, a spirit box that said something it shouldn't have, an EMF meter that spiked at exactly the wrong moment, I want to hear about it. Find me in the usual places, and if this episode got under your skin, share with someone who needs a reason to check their basement tonight. Okay, so picture this with me. A grown adult, mortgage, car payment, probably a LinkedIn profile that says paranormal consultant, is standing in a dark hallway at 2 a.m. holding a plastic box with a little antenna on it. And that box just beeped. And that adult's entire nervous system just went, the dead are here. Not, my walkie-talkie is on the wrong channel 2 rooms over. Not, I'm standing too close to a Radio Shack fever dream from 2009. No. Ghosts. Confirmed. Rolls credit. And now we're cracking open the actual toolbox, the EMF meters, the REM pods, the spirit boxes that sound like a dial-up modem, having a nervous breakdown. Every gadget you've watched some guy in a tactical vest wave around a Victorian attic while whispering, "Did you hear that?" And I want to be really honest with you up front. This episode has a body count of exactly one ego, and it's a man named Reginald Voss. You don't know him yet, you will. Because here's the thing about ghost hunting equipment. It was never really built to find ghosts. It was built to find certainty. And those are two very different products. One of them you can sell on a shelf at a convention for $89.99. The other, no one has ever managed to package. So let's get into it. So let me tell you about Reginald. Reginald Voss was, by every account that exists of him, which, fair warning, is not many, because history is cruel to men who peaked at renting church basements. An electrical engineer turned independent paranormal researcher working out of English Midlands in the early 1970s. He didn't have a lab. He had a shed. He didn't have funding. He had a pension he was aggressively not saving. What Reginald had was a theory, and it was this: if a haunting is real, it has to leave a footprint in the physical world. Something measurable. Something a machine could catch even when a human eye couldn't. Which, okay, credit where it's due, it's not a crazy idea. It's actually the same instinct that gave us seismographs and Geiger counters. Reginald just happened to build his footprint detector out of a repurposed field strength meter he bought to test radio antennas. And one deeply unfortunate assumption that ghosts are, functionally, electricians. He spent the better part of a decade in a cold house, convinced that spirits manipulate ambient electromagnetic fields to manifest, and by the end of it, in his notebooks, which, fine, may or may not exist, may or may not be something I'm dramatizing to make a very real scientific concept hit different. His notebooks describe entire rooms he's called pods, meaning charged with presence, based entirely on a needle twitching on a meter he built himself in a shed with a soldering iron and a prayer. Reginald never once considered the fridge. I want you to sit with that. This man spent 10 winters chasing needle twitches through freezing hallways and never once asked whether the 18th century farmhouse he was investigating had, I don't know, wiring installed sometime in the last 100 years. That's not a ghost story, that's a tragedy. And it's also weirdly the origin story of basically every piece of equipment in the modern ghost hunter's kit bag. So let's meet the toolbox Reginald's shed eventually spawned. Alright, Exhibit A, the granddaddy of them all, the EMF reader. This is also the very first piece of paranormal equipment I ever owned. Here's the pitch, and it's a generally elegant one. Spirits, if they exist, are energy. Energy interacts with electromagnetic fields. Therefore, A sudden spike in the ambient field around you might mean someone is nearby, trying to reach through. Investigators carry these things through a location like a Roomba with abandonment issues, establishing a baseline, normal background readings, and then watching for spikes. Or they'll plant one in a room and go full seance. If you're here, light up the red light. Very polite, very. May I speak to the manager of the afterlife? Now, here's where it gets embarrassingly fast. Old houses. The exact kind people love investigating. The ones with the good bones and the worst wiring are an EMF nightmare. Old knob and hub wiring, active breaker boxes, or poorly insulated household wiring cause continuous high spikes. That crumbling Victorian everyone's investigating for its energy, it has the electrical equivalent of a smoker's cough. Of course that meter is screaming. And it gets worse because we don't live in Reginald's shed anymore. We live in a soup of our own signal. Cell phones pinging, cell towers, Wi-Fi routers, smartwatches, and walkie-talkie emit radio frequencies that easily trigger unshielded meters, like the classic K2 meter. The little handheld box with the traffic light LEDs you've seen in literally every ghost show ever made. Every investigator on that team with a phone in their pocket is a walking false positive generator. They are, quite literally, haunting themselves. And then there's the mundane household chorus. Refrigerators cycling on and off, transformers, power strips, or microwave ovens within a few feet, all perfectly capable of making that meter light up like it just made contact with Reginald Voss's tortured spirit personally. So somewhere out there right now, tonight, there is a ghost hunting crew standing in a reverent silence around a K2 meter that is losing its mind because someone left their phone on and there's a frigid air running in the next room and they are filming it for content. Unironically. Now the REM pod is where things get a little more sophisticated. And by sophisticated, I mean it falls in a smarter way. I mean it fails in a smarter way. Unlike a passive EMF meter, which just sits there absorbing whatever field is already in the room, a REM pod is actively projects its own little bubble of electromagnetic field around a telescoping antenna. The idea is, if someone disrupts that bubble, the pod lights up and starts making noise. Proximity increases the pitch like a very morbid game of hot and cold. It's placed like a tripwire, doorways, hallway centers, the threshold of a room everyone's suddenly too nervous to walk into. And when it goes off, it feels different from the EMF meter. More deliberate, more something just walked through this specific point in space. Except walkie-talkies, transmitting on a walkie-talkie anywhere in the nearby vicinity, will reliably set off a REM pod from yards away, which means The standard ghost hunting crew radio chatter, clear. Moving in the East Wing, did you hear that? Is fully capable of triggering the exact device they're all staring at in horrified silence. And here's my favorite one because it's just physics being petty. Because the human body is conductive, an investigator simply stepped too close will trigger the field. This is basic electrostatic, not paranormal activity. You are the ghost. You, specifically. 6'2", or in my case, 5'4". Flashlight in hand, leaning in to get a better camera angle. You are the disturbance in the field. The REM pod doesn't know the difference between restless spirit and guy who got too excited and stepped forward. And then, the quietest, saddest failure of them all, the 9-volt battery drains. The circuit can become unstable, causing random erratic beeping and false triggers, which means some of the most dramatic activity ever captured on ghost hunting television is, allegorically and sometimes literally, just a dying battery having a small, unwitnessed funeral. Okay, the spirit box is one that gets people. This is the one that goes viral because this is the one that produces words. The device, models like the PSB7 or PSB11, rapidly sweeps through AM or FM radio frequencies, often at 100 to 300 milliseconds per step. The theory, and I want you to really appreciate the audacity of this theory, is that a disembodied conscious can reach out into fractured storm of radio static and audio fragments and assemble in real time a coherent response to whatever questions you just asked it out of white noise on a budget device with no hands. Investigators asked questions out loud during a live session, listening through the chaotic suite for multi-word answers that sound like a response. And sometimes, I'll admit it, it's deeply unsettling to listen to. A voice cuts through the static and it says your name. Or it answers the question you just asked. Your whole body goes cold before your brain even catches up. Here's what your brain catches up to a second later, though. High-power broadcast towers bleed full words and phrases through those fast sweeps, and human auditory pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find speech patterns in random noise, easily misinterprets those random radio fragments as coherent answers. Pareidolia is the same mechanism that makes you see a face in the wall socket or hear Yanny or Laurel, depending on what you already expect to hear. Your brain is lying to you? Exactly. Your brain isn't lying to you exactly. It's just doing its job a little too well. Pattern matching so aggressively that random noise gets sanded down into meaning. And even the clean version of the device isn't clean. Even with the external antenna physically disconnected, a strong local station signals that can still leak directly into internal tuner. There is no unplugging your way out of this one. The box is haunted by clear channel radio, not by the dead. So the most viral, most spine-chilling piece of ghost hunting evidence is in modern era is, structurally, a machine specifically engineered to generate ambiguous noise, handed to a species that is evolutionarily wired to find faces and voices in ambiguity. That's not a flaw in spirit in the spirit box. That's the entire business model. Quick rapid fire, because the secondary gear deserves the moment of shame too. The digital audio recorder used to catch EVPs, those faint voices supposedly recorded but inaudible in the moment, gets fooled by microfiction from hands holding the recorder, stomach growls, distant traffic, HVAC noises, and sound reflecting off walls. Somewhere in a ghost hunting archive is a chilling EVP that is just a man's stomach immortalized forever as evidence of the paranormal. The thermal camera, hunting for cold spots that supposedly mark a spirit's presence, gets tripped up by drafts, thermal mass inertia, like a dense brick holding onto heat longer than plaster, and body heat reflecting off shiny surfaces or glass. A cold spot isn't a doorway to the other side. It's often just a house being a house. The laser grid, projecting matrix of dots to catch something moving through the beams, gets defeated by dust particles, flying insects, smoke, camera, autofocus hunting for a subject, and lens flare. The specter breaking through the laser grid on your favorite ghost show has, in more than one occasion, been a moth living its best unpaid life. The laser grid is honestly, in my opinion, one piece of equipment I never did like. For me, it's never worked. I've talked to other teams who's used it, and they said they've never picked up on it. Hopefully, other people, maybe it does work. To me, it's not worth it. But that's my personal opinion. And an SLS camera, the one that draws stick figures skeleton over a detected human shape, the single most jump scare inducing piece of gear in the entire arsenal, is a depth mapping pareidolia machine in its own right. Its algorithms can mistake chair backs, lamp bases, door frames, or shadows for human posture. That skeletal figure standing in the corner of the room, silently watching you, might generally just be a coat rack having the best night of its life. So let's close the loop on Reginald Voss. By most accounts, again, thin, scattered, the kind of thing you find in a footnote of a footnote. Reginald spent the last years of his research completely convinced he had mapped the electromagnetic architecture of the afterlife. Rooms with reoccurring hot readings became, in his mind, doorways, places the dead use like hallways. What he never built, never once in that shed, was a control. He never turned off the breaker and measured the room again. He never asked what else in the house could account for the field he was chasing. He built a machine capable of detecting change and then supplied all the meaning himself for free every single time it changed. And that's the quiet horror underneath this whole toolbox, isn't it? It's not that the equipment is fake exactly. An EMF reader really does detect electromagnetic fields. A thermal camera really does detect heat. A laser grid really does detect motion. The machines are honest. They are relentlessly, mechanically honest. It's the human standing next to them, cold and scared, and wanting so badly for the universe to answer back. Who does the haunting? We walk into a dark room, already primed to be afraid. And then we hand a beeping box the authority to confirm it. Reginald wasn't a fraud. I don't think he ever meant to lie to anyone. I think he was just a man in a shed who built a very sensitive way to measure his own fear and mistook the reading for a message. Maybe that's what all this equipment really is. Not proof of the dead, a translator for the living. For how badly we want to not be alone in the dark. Which, honestly, might be the most haunted thing in this whole episode. So next time you see a K2 meter light up on your screen or a spirit box mutter something that sounds just like your name, I'm not telling you not to feel the chill. Feel it. That's allowed. That's human. Just maybe also check if someone in the room has their phone on. Now, I'm not saying at all that paranormal equipment does not work. I've obviously had some, have some, use it to do investigations. It kind of helps. It helps you out in a way. What I'm saying is there is a lot of things that can affect the equipment. So if you're going to use equipment, please make sure when something goes off that there's nothing before you say it's paranormal, make sure nothing else is interfering with it and making it go off. That's it for tonight's descent. I'm your host, and this has been the Phantom Navigator. Wherever you're listening from, lights off, doors locked, phones conveniently glowing right next to your very sensitive ghost hunting equipment. Thanks for haunting this feed with me. Till next time, stay skeptical, stay scared, and stay listening. I'll see you next time.